Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our FUSD Budget Town Hall. I appreciate all of you taking the time to be part of this important conversation. As we did earlier this year with budget reductions, we held community town halls to discuss our budget conditions, our fiscal reality, our challenges. And we're at the point in our fiscal process where we have presented to our Board of Education our initial budget proposal, and it will come back for the Board of Education's further discussion and review at our second board meeting in June. And this is an opportunity for our community members, our staff, parents, and guardians to learn more about Fremont Unified School District's budget and where our fiscal condition is headed. We've certainly had a lot of new information provided from the state that is different than our projections from 12 months ago. So we're very excited to have our interim associate superintendent, Mr. Raul Perengao, who is returning to Fremont Unified School District to help us out. And he is going to give us a presentation, which was recently shared with our Board of Education, which outlines the key areas of Fremont Unified School District's proposed budget for the next year and highlights some areas of the state funding based on the governor's May revise. It is important to note that our projections are exactly that. They're projections. They're based on the governor's May revise, and we won't know the definitive state budget roughly until the middle or the end of June. So we do the best we can with the information we have in the moment. And at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Associate Superintendent Perengao.
Thank you. Well, as Ms. Sandoval is bringing the presentation, I just want to greet you this this evening, and welcome and thank you for joining us in this very important topic. And so, as Superintendent Kamak mentioned, that this presentation has been presented to the board on June 2nd, and we just would like to give you the opportunity to be able to view it and have the opportunity to ask some questions. And so can we go into the next slide, please? So the preparation of the budget and the submission of the budget is in accordance with Education Code 42127, which there are three steps that we need to do in order for us to be able to finalize that. The first one is to hold a public hearing of the budget for the subsequent year. And that was done on June 2nd. The next step is to adopt the budget, which we are scheduled to submit to the board for adoption on June 24th. And then the final step is to submit the budget to the county superintendent of schools. Next slide, please. Before we go into the 21-22 proposed budget, we would like to do a quick review of the current budget, which is 2021. And here on this slide, you will see the progression of our budget from the time that it was adopted last June, all the way to the current environment. And so the first adoption, the first revision that we did was on 45 days, and the next one was the first interim in December, and the next one was in the second interim in March of 2021. And then on June 2nd, we presented to the board the estimated actual, pretty much representing how it would look like as close as possible to the year end. And so what you would see here is that our revenue is projected to be roughly 429 million, and our expenditure is about $417 million, which shows a surplus of about $12 million. You will notice a big difference between the second interim and the estimated actual, and I'll explain that in a moment. We started with a beginning balance of 32 million, and the ending balance is about 44 million. And off of that, we set aside $12.5 million as a designation, which leaves us with about $31.3 million in reserve, or equivalent to about 7.51%. And because of that difference, you will notice that our reserve went up from 3.77% to 7.51%. The big difference between the revenues of about roughly $20 million was primarily due to some additional funding that we received in the current year that is meant to be spent for next year. you probably heard about the ELOG grant, or the Expanded Learning and Opportunity Grant, which is roughly about $22 million. And so that is the main reason why there is a significant increase. But the expenditure really has not increased that much, just because the expenditure is expected to happen in the next year. Next slide, please. The 2021 general fund budget is actually made up of two major components. The first one is the unrestricted general fund and the restricted general fund. This slide right here is similar to the previous one, except that we broke them into two major components. The biggest difference between the two, especially on the middle columns, is restricted general fund. Those money are coming to the district. We call them the categorical program. They're earmarked dollars. We receive those money with specific guidelines on how to spend them, whereas the unrestricted general fund are primarily for general purpose. And so the biggest takeaway from this slide is that if you look at the second line, which is contribution, we are contributing roughly $57.5 million from unrestricted general fund to restricted general fund. And that is made primarily of special education program and routine restricted maintenance. Special education program is incurring a deficit, a budget deficit of roughly about 44 million, which simply means that they're getting 44 million less than what they are spending. And therefore, we have to contribute from the unrestricted general fund. The routine restricted maintenance, which is the difference, is a requirement by the law that we have to transfer 3% of the total general fund budget to maintain our facilities and our building. And so that is the makeup of those $57.5 million. The other takeaway from this slide is also, you will notice that in restricted general fund, we do not generate reserve. And the reason is because, as I mentioned earlier, those dollars are earmarked dollars. The state gives us those money in order for us to use for specific programs, and it's not meant to be used for a reserve. And so that's why you'll notice that the reserve, you could find that only in the unrestricted general fund. Next slide, please. So in order for us to build the 21-22, we have to rely on assumptions. And as Superintendent Kamak mentioned earlier, that we received some of those assumptions coming from the state. You know, the governor spoke in January and announced what the state budget would look like for the next year. And he further made revision on it in May. Based on those information, we developed the budget. And so how do we build a revenue? So in this slide, you will see that the local control funding formula, which is the largest source of revenue of the district, there are several components of them in order for us to be able to calculate how much LCFF we should receive. And those are the attendance rate, or the ADA, the cost of living adjustment that we get from the state, the unduplicated pupil percent, which is all listed right here. So those are the elements in order for us to, to come up with the numbers. But it is important to note that we are getting a little bit of benefit this year and next year. It's just because we're allowed to use an ADA that was for 2019-20. The state recognized that during pandemic, that it's there's a tendency that the ADA is lower, and so they allowed us to use the higher number. The federal revenues we projected to remain flat. However, some of the one-time money, like the CARES Act and the Learning Loss Mitigation Fund, are not included in 21-22, just because those were one-time funds in the current year. In the state revenue, we continue to receive lottery funds at about $199 per student. The cost of living adjustment for special education is 4.05%, while the categorical program is going to be receiving 1.7%. We also receive other funds like mandated cost block grant, 1.4 million, and we get one-time fund for 7.8 million in the current year, but it's not included in the 21-22. I have mentioned about the ELOG funds. The first half was received in the current year, but the second half will be received in the next year. Local revenues, we get local donations, we use the historical trend depending on how much we got over the last 5 years, and we use that as our basis in projecting what the future might look like. We also receive parcel tax, which is about $4.3 million. And this year, we started to budget for the full year of rents and leases now that the board has allowed us to be able to rent our indoor and outdoor facilities starting in June. Next slide, please. In developing our expenditure assumptions, we had to use the classroom staffing based on this class size. As noted here, class size for TK and K at 24 and all the way to 30:1 at grades 4 to 6. Our grade 7 to 12 ratio is 27.5:1. In the salaries, we included the stepping column adjustment, but we have not projected any salary increases for the current year. Because of 1%, if you would want to calculate how much it would cost to provide a 1% salary increase, it would cost the district a $3.5 million inclusive of the statutory benefits. We also have to make pension contribution, which is projected to be 16.92% for our certificated staff and 22.91% for our classified staff. The unemployment insurance rate has gone up quite dramatically. It's from 0.05% for every dollar that we pay up to 1.23%, which is an increase of 2,360% from the prior year. And if you're interested in how much that will cost the district, that is roughly about $4.1 million of price tag for 21-22. Our special education program, as I mentioned, is operating on a deficit, and so the expenditure is $87.4 million. And so we're experiencing a budget deficit of $50.9 million in 21-22. Our supplemental grant, which is earmarked dollars for our eligible students, $16.3 million. And the support staff for the RICS Early Learning Center is included in 21-22. They are slated to open in the fall. All the approved budget cuts that the board had made in the early part of spring has been implemented. The one-time expenditures due to one-time revenues are not included in this budget. There is no contribution to cafeteria fund. We estimated that the cafeteria fund will be self-sustaining just because the reimbursement rate are going to increase, and we also are giving all sorts of waivers from the government. And finally, this assumption is based on a full reopening starting in the fall. We are continuously transferring a $4.3 million to Mission Valley ROP, and the cost of school resource officer and the virtual learning academy are included and is funded by the CARES Act money. Next slide. So based on all that assumption between revenue and expenditures, we built the budget. And we are estimating a revenue for 21-22, which is the middle column, $414 million, and our expenditures at $426.2 million, and we are projecting a deficit of $12.3 million. I just want to make sure that you don't get alarmed with that deficit, because that is because of ELOG. We are getting half of the money in the prior year, and we are getting the second half in the current year, but we're spending the full amount in 21-22. And that's why if you look at the first column, you will see that there's a designation of $12.5 million. That's right about third line from the bottom. And that 12.3 deficit that you see is primarily made up of ELOG funds, because we have a timing difference in terms of when we spend and when we receive the money. Our beginning balance is projected at $44 million, and our ending balance is projected at $31.5 million. We are designating about $0.6 million, and that leaves us with about $31 million in reserve, or equivalent to about 7.26%. Next slide, please. Similar to the prior year, or to the 2021, we broke them down between unrestricted and restricted. And again, the takeaway right here is the contribution, which is the third line. You would see that our contribution has grown from $57 million to $63.2 million. It's about $30.9 million at 7.26%. Next slide, please. Part of the requirements for us to develop the budget is to create or to make a multi-year budget projection for the 2 subsequent years, which is for 22-23 and 23-24. The succeeding assumptions that you will hear are mainly designed for the next 2 out years. And here again on LCFF, you will see all the numbers that we are using in calculating the LCFF. And what you will notice here is that our enrollment is projected to decline. And as a result, our ADA is projected to decline. We are no longer able to use the hold harmless, meaning like we will be using the higher ADA of the current year versus the prior year. But since our enrollment is declining, our ADA is also declining. And also our unduplicated pupil percent remained pretty stable at about 26.8%. The cost of living adjustment is projected at 2.48% for next year and 3.11% for the year out. The cost of living for state revenue adjustment for state revenues are roughly the same, 248 and 311. ELOG funds are no longer included in 22-23 and 23-24 because we have to spend all the money in 21-22. Local donations are also based on historical trend, and we will continue to receive our parcel tax at $4.3 million. Next slide, please. Our expenditure assumptions for the 2 out years, we are not projecting any change in class size and class ratio. Our staffing have been adjusted based on the decline in enrollment. So naturally, there would be some reduction in the number of teachers and other staff because of the reduction in enrollment. But the step and column adjustments are included in the projection. No salary increases have been projected, however, in the 2 out years. But the cost of 1% is approximately $3.5 million. Our pension contribution are projected to increase. As you see here, it would be 19.1% for the 2 out years. And for our classified staff, it would be 26.1 and 27.1%. Our unemployment rate is projected to remain at 1.23. And so we hope that that change, but at this point, we don't have any information whether it's going to stay or it's going to decline. We are projecting an election cost of about $0.4 million because there is an upcoming trustee election next year. We are still projecting a transfer of $4.3 million to our Mission Valley ROP. The supplemental grant is steadily increasing for the next 2 years. This time we are projecting to open the Bringhurst Elementary School in 22-23. Thus, all the support staff are included starting that year. And the Thornton, Centerville, and Hopkins Middle School conversion are expected to complete and start on 22-23. Thus, we are including the support staff also. The cost of school resource officer is included and funded by the unrestricted general fund. So you'll notice that I did not have the Virtual Learning Academy included here because Virtual Learning Academy is intended to be in place for 1 year, and we will analyze them, see if we need to continue in the out years. But at this time, we did not project for it. No restoration of prior budget reductions, but there is also no projection for any new budget reductions in the subsequent years. And so that's a good thing because we have been cutting our budget layers after layers for the last several years. Next slide, please. So with all of that assumptions, we build our multi-year projections. So we've already discussed the second column, is 21-22. But if you look at the 22-23 and 23-24, here we showed you what the projected revenues and the projected expenditures. But I'd like to bring to your attention the reserve, because you will notice that the reserve is declining from 7.26% to 5.87% to 5.6%. And the main reason for that is because we're still operating on a structural deficit. As you could see on the third line, we are operating on a deficit by 6.6 million and 0.9 million in the 2 subsequent years. And so naturally, when there is a deficit, that would slowly drain our reserve. And so just important to note that, because as we are planning for the out years, we need to be mindful about what the reserve level for the out years. Next slide, please. The district also operates other funds. And so some of you might be wondering, where are we getting the money to spend for building classrooms and modernization and things like that. You would see on the middle part of this slide, building fund, measure E. Those are the general obligation bond that the voters approved in 2014. And so we are well underway and probably 2/3 done in all our projects. And so that's where we're getting the money to spend for those renovations and modernization. We are not using the general fund money to build the buildings and modernize our facilities. The other two funds that we use for some of those renovations and modernization is the Capital Facilities Fund and Special Reserve Fund for capital outlay. So I just want to be able to share that with you. We also have funds for cafeteria fund. So this is what I was mentioning earlier, that all our cafeteria, the child nutrition program, are funded by this program. Next slide, please. So what are the next steps in the next couple of weeks? The final adoption, I think this needs to be updated because the board changed the board meeting. It should be June 24, 2021 instead of June 2023. So at that date, we will be presenting the proposed budget, and that would be subject to board approval. At this point, the state has not adopted the budget, the state budget, and so we anticipate that that would be adopted before June 30th, but we don't know when. The staff attend School Services of California workshop after the governor signed the budget in July. And after that, we will report back to the board and to the community what the impact of the state enacted budget, which we call the 45-day budget revision, and sometime in August. And so I think that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parangawa. Before we move to our community members or staff members or students who may have tuned in for this presentation, I want to just highlight some of the feedback that we received. As you may know, we put out a form earlier for community members, parents, guardians, students, staff to provide input regarding questions or concerns they may have in the budget. I just want to highlight a few of the things that were trending in those responses. When looking at those responses, there were a number of responses asking the district to spend more on computer and science labs, to spend more on employees and teacher salaries, to spend more on counselors, to spend more on smaller class sizes, to spend more on AP course offerings, to spend more on mental health support, to spend more on facilities, to spend more on electives, arts, sports, to spend more on COVID safety upgrades, to spend more on GATE, and more on STEM. The trends of responses in terms of spending less, there were trends of requesting that the district spend less on new facilities, less on sports, and less on electives. So you can see there in those three examples, there's some overlap between the desires for some people to spend more and some to spend less on those items. And there was also a trend asking the district to spend less on school resource officers. Some of the questions that we received that I just want to address up front. One of them is, where can we find details and a full breakdown of the FUSD budget? That information is posted on our website, and it's also posted as exhibits for each of our board meetings where we bring forward a board item or board presentation. Another question we received is, why is Bringhurst Elementary still empty? And that is because we don't yet have sufficient enrollment to open up that site based on previously established criteria. That development in the surrounding area has not produced as many students that are school-age students as was originally anticipated. And we're hopeful that we see those students generated soon so we can open up that beautiful campus. Some of the other questions that we got were, how will our enrollment projections over the next few years impact our budget? I think Mr. Parangawa helped address that in terms of our multi-year projection. We are addressing that in planning for a lower enrollment, which means lower revenue. Another question that we got was, why is the district constantly having to cut costs? And that question is ultimately addressed in a simple context that our expenditures continue to exceed our revenues in a more complex context, it is, in my opinion, because we don't receive ample funding from the state and federal government to keep up with the mandated costs that are provided to us. A quick example of that, even though we're not projecting cuts for the next year, is you can see that we've received a significant increase in revenue based on the governor's May revise, but at the same time, our unemployment insurance is going up significantly, which right off the bat takes roughly $4 million per year out of the equation. And so those are some of the challenges that we continue to see. Other questions included, how would we address the disparity in the quality of facilities across the district? And I know our board and our staff is very focused on our bond projects as well as other facility funding to make sure that we're looking through the lens of equity in our facilities. And will we be seeing an expansion in the types of elective opportunities available to students? Right now, we haven't budgeted specifically for that, but we are having a conversation in a future board meeting about elective course offerings, and there may be further conversation that happens related to that. We have built into the Expanded Learning Opportunity Grant provided additional sections, but those have been primarily focused on addressing the learning loss mitigation that may have taken place through distance learning. And with that, I will move on to our participants that are on the call. Ms. Sandoval, are you able to call on participants? And as you're looking at the list, I want to remind our participants that this is not the same as a structured board meeting. We will do our best to respond to the questions that are provided, but I would ask each participant to be very mindful of their time so that one participant is not taking too long with their question. And if we have time, we'll come back around for additional questions. Thank you.
Yes, we will start off with Padma Gopalakrishnan.
Thank you very much. I had a couple of questions and a comment. The Scola often people are not clear about what its intended purpose is. Is it meant only for salary raises, or is it meant to be a cost of living adjustment for the district as a whole for its expenses? If you could please clarify a little bit about that. And second thing was on the salary increases. You had mentioned something about only doing a column and step and not any additional increase there. That is what we would like to see. I think we need to keep our increasing our reserves instead of utilizing every dollar that we have to go towards raises. So I'd really appreciate it if we can stick to step and column and not have additional raises. Thank you.
Thank you, Padma. I will real quickly just address the COLA and ask Mr. Parangao to see what I may have missed. I think in general, when I look at the COLA, there's an attachment to that name which comes back from the old funding models for schools. And when we were under that model, which was generally referred to as the revenue limit model, we would receive a COLA, and it was a little bit different at that time. Right now, when we receive a COLA, even though it's referred to as the cost of living adjustment, in principle, it is the way that the state increases the overall funding for schools. So the COLA, the mega COLA that is provided in the governor's proposal of just over 5%, is driven to the base level funding for LCFF. And that's our local control funding formula. And that raises the level of funding for all school districts across the state that are under the LCFF formula. However, other funds don't get the same cost of living adjustment. So it's not applied across the entire budget for the state. It's not applied across the entire budget for schools. In general, I look at the COLA as the mechanism in which the state increases our level of funding. And that increase is the same funding that we have to use to pay for our STRS increases, for things like our unemployment cost increases, and other mandated costs, while at the same time addressing the need to recruit and retain great employees for our students. So the amount of needs that are competing for the COLA are always very intense. Mr. Parangao, is there other information you want to add in terms of the COLA?
Yes, I just like to add more into it in a sense that whenever we hear the governor speaks, generally in January and February, when we hear the governor made a proposal in terms of increases by via COLA, that represents half of the story. The other half of the story is to also find out how much additional expenditures is the state imposing into the district. And I think I've mentioned in the presentation, one of which is the unemployment benefit rate, which right off the bat, 4.1 million, increase in pension contribution. And if you notice also that the increase in deficit for our special education program, which is unfunded, insufficiently funded mandate, increased by 6 million. So before we start looking into how much money is left, we need to first meet the obligations that is imposed on us. And so a lot of times we hear about the COLA, which is a mega COLA, but sometimes we miss the opportunity in figuring out how much is the additional expenditures. And so I think we need to be able to see both sides of those. In terms of the comment on the step and column, I also would like to say that we have collective bargaining labor negotiations, and I think it's important to note that if and when there's any salary increases, those are out of labor negotiation, and so that this is the reason why we did not budget for any projected salary increase, because those has not occurred as of yet.
Okay, our next speaker is Arun Saha.
Hello. Yeah, so thanks for this presentation. I was trying to get to why we seem to be in kind of a downward spiral on our budget, and I tried to look at some comparable districts. And one of the districts I took a look at is San Ramon Valley. What I do note, because it serves a similar number of students, they serve about 32.5K, and we serve 34, somewhere between 34 and 35. And what I noticed is their expenditures on certificated salaries is 152 million, while ours is about 198 million. So that's a gap of almost 46 million. They do have higher benefits while we don't. And I think that comes down to the fact that we don't pay for insurance, health insurance. That is included in the salary for our employees, while other districts provide insurance. So my question is, does the higher salary also mean an increased pension contribution, which keeps on increasing? Is the pension contribution dependent just on salary or salary and benefits? And if we were to restructure it in a certain way to what certain other school districts do, which is provide insurance and salary, is that feasible? First of all, I know it would go with you'd have to bargain for that, and late 90s everyone decided they wanted high salaries. But is that a road we'd like to take, given that health insurance is such an important matter for younger teachers, and also these large pension costs? I have a couple of other questions, but I will let you answer that.
Go. You want me to? Okay. So to your first question about the comparison between San Ramon and Fremont Unified School District, I think you're absolutely right. We do not pay medical insurance, and therefore it's actually added to the salary. Therefore, that's why you see the salary amount to be higher. Whereas in San Ramon, they pay health benefits, and so if you add health benefits to the salary, it probably would be just about the same. But to your second point about where is the pension contribution based on the base salary, the answer is yes. So the higher the base salary is, the higher pension cost we incur. And so in the case of San Ramon, if their base salary is lower, then their cost of pension would be lesser. And I don't know if I'm missing other questions. Superintendent Kamak, did you pick up the last part of the question?
Well, yes, thank you, Mr. Parangal. The last part of the question is really a question about if the district may be interested at a future point in trying to restructure how we deliver our total compensation to employees and how that might be connected to the implications for our PERS and STIRS or pension contributions. And I think that every school district is looking at the best way to handle that. And, really, while I appreciate the question, that would be something that would have to be negotiated. The district and the Board of Education can't in and of itself make that change unilaterally. Under the state laws for collective bargaining, we have an obligation to bargain compensation with employees and benefits with employees. And so with each of our labor groups, which includes FUTA, CSEA, and SEIU, we would need to engage in negotiations with each one of those groups at the direction of the board. And we also have a managers association, which goes through a meet and confer process, not a formal collective bargaining process. So certainly the feedback is heard, and beyond hearing that feedback, I can't speak on behalf of what the board may want to do in the future in that regard. And I would just highlight that any such change would be subject to negotiations.
I think you're
Pat
on mute.
Wilson,
Yeah, okay.
Pat Wilson, go ahead.
Hi, Mr. Superintendent and leadership staff. Thanks for the presentation. I have 3 questions and 1 comment. The first question is that with the county requiring the district to provide 2 future years budget forecast, does this say what kind of assumption can be used? For example, a lot of budget depends on the state COLA. Does the county have any regulation on what kind of assumption can be used for COLA and also for the total number of enrollment? Question number 1. Question number 2 is that in addition to break down the expenditures into a different employee group, would it be possible to also include the full-time employee counts in the budget slide so that it's easier for the community to know how the full-time employee counts changes as the enrollment number changes? Thank you. And the third question is that the per student funding level from the state is different across the different grades. Does the Fremont Unified have any breakdown on its spending across different grade level? That's the 3 questions I have. The 1 comment I have is that, it's very clear that the Fremont Unified is already in the red for next year and the 2 years outwards. I urge the district to freeze the salary table in the ongoing contract negotiation with different employee groups. We cannot continue the deficit spending in the way that it has been done in the past. In the past, every time we have a salary increase through the contract negotiation, we have to go through a budget cut in the immediate future. So I urge the district to be disciplined in the salary negotiation and freeze the salary table going forward. Thank you.
So, Superintendent, do you want me to respond to the first 2 or maybe 3? So, in regards to the cost of living adjustment, those numbers that you see in the slides are provided by the Department of Finance and also one of our professional organizations called School Services of California. Those are where the numbers are coming from. It involves a very sophisticated calculation. The County Office of Education uses the same number to provide guidance to our school districts. And so consistently up and down the state, the same numbers are being used. And we don't have the latitude or the flexibility to use any other number because the County Office of Education is the one who reviews our budget, and they want to make sure that we are using what has been provided by the Department of Finance. Any number higher than that definitely could result in a potential write-up from the County Office of Education. You could certainly use a lower number to be more conservative, but anything higher than the projected number could have some negative impact. In terms of the FTE count, yes, that is a great suggestion. I think we should include that in our future presentation to provide information on the changes. So I think you might be referring to, if the enrollment will decline by 300 students, how many teachers are we how many FTE will the reduction be? And because we don't have them on the slide, I could just tell you that we are using approximately 28:1 as an average ratio. And so if you take the 300 divided by 28, that is pretty much the number of teachers that we would lose. The reason why we use 28 is because at various grade level, we have different class size, which is 24:1, 28:1, and 30:1 in some other grade level. And so for purposes of calculation, we use 28 as our average. Was there anything else that I missed on that, Superintendent?
Thanks, Mr. Parangal. The other comment was just in regards to freezing the salary schedule or the salary table and the impacts that increase in compensation can have on the district's budget. I thank you for the public comment. My clarifying point would be that there's kind of two components to that. There's actually freezing the salary schedule, which means nobody moves forward on step and column at all. And if that were to be done, again, that would be subject to collective bargaining, because the current collective bargaining agreement set forward the salary schedule, and our employees move over in their step and column annually based on that established salary schedule. When the other consideration, if you're referring to freezing salary, is as another public comment was provided tonight, to not agree to an increase. So I would just highlight again that those are a product of collective bargaining and the outcome of negotiations, and we appreciate the input from the community.
Next, we have Priya Raman.
Hi, thank you for having this town hall and educating us, and thank you for taking my question. Question is, the board and superintendent yourself have agreed that mental health
Priya, I'm
that
so
there is
sorry,
no
but
plans for
it seems like,
increased in
Priya, I'm so sorry. It seems like we're losing you. The last
Hello?
thing I heard you say was mental health.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to try this again. All across the district, the board, as well as you, Superintendent Comack, have agreed that mental health will be a big issue when students come back to school. I also saw in the budget that there are no plans for increase in expenditure. How are we going to, are you going to plan to have additional counselors and mental health professionals to help these students when they come back? And how does that fit in the budget?
Thank you so much for that question, Priya. It is in the budget, but it's called out a little bit differently than you might be looking for. So in the prior board meeting, the last board meeting in May, the board approved our expanded learning opportunity grant plan. And the additional counseling support that's being provided for next year is a part of the $21.6 million that the state provided for the expanded learning opportunity grants. So the additional counseling is specified in that expenditure plan. In the budget that was presented tonight, Mr. Parangal can provide clarification if I'm incorrect in this, but for the information that was presented tonight, you're seeing that incorporated into where the ELOG, Expanded Learning Opportunity Grant dollars, exist within this budget.
So in regards to some of the details, I think what you have seen tonight as a presentation is made up of probably 12 to 13 slides, which is extracted from about a 300 pages document of a budget. And so the when you don't see an increase in expenditure, it doesn't mean that we are not including what has been explained as the ELOG funds. What it simply means is that in between years, there are pluses and there are minuses, and for various reasons. For example, I mentioned in the assumptions that all the one-time funds that we have in the current year are not included in the out years or in the 21-22. That is a minus in our expenditure. However, ELOG funds, we received the funds for the half of them this year and the second half next year, and the entire 22 million is a plus in the expenditures. And so after we summarize all the pluses and minuses in the budget, what you saw on the slide is the outcome. And so just because you're not seeing an increase in the total expenditure doesn't mean that those programs are not included. When we presented the budget on June 2nd and again on June 24th, there is another attachment to our agenda, which is about 300-page document that has all the details. And we try to make it as user-friendly as possible, but we understand that school budget is a very complicated topic, and that's why we are holding this meeting. So when you get an opportunity to examine that, perhaps on June 24th, we would welcome any questions that you might have if you have any specific pages that you would like to cover. So.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr. Faringa. Thank you, Priya. And I don't see any hands at the moment, but I will follow up on an additional question that was provided through our form submission. And that is, how does the Fremont Unified School District budget compare with other Bay Area school districts? And I think that's always an important topic to consider. When we look at our funding levels in Fremont Unified, most districts in the state of California are under the LCFF funding formula. The few that aren't are considered basic aid districts, and that's a designation that they have based on the fact that their local taxes exceed the amount of money that they would receive under the state's funding formula. So for Fremont Unified as an LCFF district, we do not receive the same amount of funding as all other districts in the Bay Area. And I think that's an important consideration. The amount of funding that we receive is based on the LCFF funding formula, which is also predicated on something called supplemental and concentration grant dollars. And so our unduplicated count is roughly 27%. Unduplicated students are students who are English language learners, homeless and foster youth, socioeconomically disadvantaged students. And the reason it's referred to as unduplicated is if a student is identified in more than one of those areas, they can't be counted twice. And under the LCFF funding formula, districts that have over 50% of an unduplicated percentage receive significantly more funding than districts that don't. Our district, being roughly at 27%, receives roughly a 20% increase in funding in that area. Additionally, when we look across the state and across the Bay Area, local revenue and parcel taxes also play a significant role in school funding. And so those are areas that I think are always important to consider. When you look at our district across Alameda County, on a per pupil revenue, we're one of the lowest. And I think that's an important consideration as well. Mr. Parengau, is there other information regarding LCFF or our level of funding compared to other Bay Area districts that would be important considerations?
Yes, yeah, in addition to that, I think a district like perhaps just to make some comparison, let's say Oakland Unified School District, which is now roughly about the same size as Fremont, although they have more schools. But their funding is significantly more than Fremont, just because they have a concentration grant. And if you look at the per student, that's higher than ours. The other part that I think is important is that local revenue, like the parcel tax, we are probably one of the lowest parcel tax revenue in Alameda County, and probably similar size district in the Bay Area. And so we have districts in Alameda that has over $1,000 per parcel. That's per parcel per year that supports their school. Ours is significantly less than that, and we generate about 4.3 million per year. And so those are some of the biggest differences in funding.
Superintendent, we do have one other hand that's just gone up. Pat Wilson.
Hi, thank you for taking me once again. I think that I just have one question that I asked earlier, but somehow falls through the crack. I guess the question is that the state funded the school with different funding for per student depends on the grade of the student. Does Fremont Unified has a breakdown on its spending across different grade level? Thank you.
Yes, yes, we do. And earlier I referred to another attachment to our board agenda, and I think I don't know exactly what page it is, but if you flip through the page, roughly around maybe from page 65 and up, you will see a page called Assumptions for Multi-Year Projection. There is a table on that pages that would show what the funding per grade span. And I say grade span because the funding for TK to 3 is one number, funding for 4 to 6 is another, and then 7, 8, and then 9, 12. And so you will be able to see the per student funding on those tables.
Thank you, Mr. Parangal. Well, I think we've addressed the questions that were provided in advance. I think we have had some great input from our community. I thank all of you who are here attending for joining us. I appreciate your involvement and interest in the fiscal condition for Fremont Unified School District, as that is a driving factor in so many of the things that we do and the things that we want to do. So I really appreciate your participation. Mr. Parangal, Mr. Kilgore, Ms. Sandoval, thank you very much. And Mr. Zamora, thank you for being here to help us put on this event. And again, we welcome participation in our community board meeting. And if you have other questions, you certainly can find that information or how to contact us on our Fremont Unified School District website. So on behalf of our team, I thank you very much for being with us, and we wish you a wonderful rest of the week, and congratulations to all of our staff and students who have closed out their instructional year this year. Take care.